Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Well, today we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. First on the agenda is there has been some videos released of an alleged warehouse in which the Ukrainian military is claiming that they are manufacturing these low observable kamikaze boats that have been used in a fairly effective manner against Russian both naval targets and merchant marine targets as well. Now, that warehouse in which you see a lineup of these kamikaze boats, these low observable boats that sit very low in the water. They're controlled by GPS receiver, and they rely on U.S. intelligence to then go to these areas and attack these Russian ships. Now, that site that was being shown on that specific video, we believe here at MFAN that site, that warehouse, was actually destroyed some weeks ago in a Russian missile strike. So are the Ukrainians still producing those systems? Possibly. Are they producing them at that locale? Probably not. Again, because we believe, again, that site was destroyed. And feel free to find it. It's out there. You'll see a warehouse, and then you'll see a long line of these kamikaze boats that are quote unquote being produced. Ironically enough, they've already been produced, and they're sitting there waiting for deployment, kept under wraps in this warehouse. Now, the ongoing fighting for Avdiivka. Now, I know this is going to be tough for the Ukrainian sympathizer to hear. Obviously, the summer offensive for the Ukrainians failed. The Zaporizhzhia offensive that was supposed to drive Russian forces to the sea, split Russian forces between Crimea and Novorossiya, that failed. So the consolation prize for the Ukrainians is twofold. One is the small-scale amphibious operations that are taking place in and around Krinky and other areas on the eastern bank of the Dnieper River. And then there is this concept that the Russians are taking thousands of casualties. Thousands upon thousands of Russians are dying in this Avdiivka offensive. Now, are Russians dying in the offensive? Yes, absolutely, as are Ukrainians. Now, are thousands of Russian troops dying in this offensive? No, we don't believe that is happening. And I'll try to explain what we're seeing on the ground in and around Avdiivka. We are seeing a very methodical operation by Russian forces that is relying predominantly on airstrikes and long-range artillery strikes against Ukrainian positions. Other than the area, just to the east, it would be more of an east by southeast locale. This area here is fairly wooded, and this is really the only forested area right now in this area of operations. This area is also, we're seeing in terms of Russian forces, we're seeing elements of the 90th Tank Division being supported by the 55th Mountain Brigade of Russian forces, also being augmented with Russian Special Operations Forces and Spetsnaz forces as well in this area. But outside of this area that is just east of Avdiivka, the areas to the south, to the north, to the west are very flat with absolutely no trees nor foliage. Now, this satellite image was obviously taken during the summer. All these, the foliage that separates these farming fields, that's non-existent now. All this foliage has died off in the winter. And again, we're essentially seeing a very, very flat area. Now, what the Russians are doing, they are degrading and destroying Ukrainian forces with the use of air power and some of these long-range missile strikes, anti-tank guided weapon strikes with attack helicopters. We're seeing more of the airstrikes with fixed-wing aircraft being used, 1,000-pound, 2,000-pound glide bombs being used against the fortified settlement of Avdiivka. Again, there's essentially no civilians in this area now. It is essentially a Russian free fire zone that is just being pummeled day in and day out by the Russian Air Force. And then areas in these open fields, the Russians are able to attack with their long-range missile strikes on their helicopters. Very difficult situation for the Ukrainians. And if and when the Ukrainians do dig in these open fields, that's when the Russians start launching these GLONASS precision-guided glide bomb strikes against these locales. So the probability is that Russian casualties are probably less than what we're seeing in terms of Ukrainian casualties, especially in this area. Now look, yes, we have seen operations by the Russians earlier in the Avdiivka campaign in which a convoy of Russian vehicles were destroyed. We probably saw about a battalion-sized set of Russian vehicles destroyed. Now, does that equal thousands of Russian troops killed in action? It doesn't. A battalion set of Russian motorized infantry and tanks is about 300 to 600 personnel. And the likelihood that all of those personnel were wiped out is kind of a stretch. Now, we've seen other operations by the Russians, such in areas such as Volhodar, where in all probability, again, the Russians suffered large losses. Again, motorized tank mechanized attack against Volhodar was repelled by Ukrainian forces. But right now, again, this consolation prize is the Ukrainians essentially saying, well, look, they haven't taken Avdiivka and they're losing thousands upon thousands of troops. Well, the Ukrainians are still having to staff these positions. They're still having to move forces into this area and use those forces to defend against Russian attack. And in doing so, they're putting themselves in these fairly open positions to be attacked by Russian fixed-wing aircraft, attack helicopters. And that's what we're seeing. Now, that is what is causing this divide, this fracture in the Ukrainian military apparatus and the political regime led by Zelensky in Kiev. The political body in Kiev does not want to lose any more territory, and they have instituted this not one step back mentality. The military leadership is well aware that they are taking more casualties than the Russians, especially with that strategy in this type of terrain. Look, if this was a completely urbanized area with forests and hills, that would look a little different. But the Ukrainians, again, are putting themselves in a position when they're sitting in open fields and trying to defend these open fields from Russian airstrikes. And they're just setting ducks. And they're dying in position. And that's what's happening. And that's what's causing this fracture between the Ukrainian military leadership and the political leadership in Kiev. The military, under Zelensky, wants to do something different. He understands that he cannot maintain these lines in these open fields in the dead of winter against the Russian Air Force. It is suicide. Now you have this political issue here in the United States where the dumbed down politicians in Washington who know nothing about military affairs other than what happened previously. Again, the politicians in Washington, the politicians in the European Union are looking at some of these successes that the Ukrainians had earlier in the war. The paradigm has changed. The Ukrainians, are no longer able to do that. What worked 6 months ago is not working now. The Russians have developed this incredible ability to sense and then attack Ukrainian positions very quickly. They are adapting to this new way of war. Now, did they have that capability earlier in the conflict? A little bit, but not as much as they do now, meaning the Russians. And that's the problem for the Ukrainians. So when you hear about the fact that they're saying the Russians are dying by the thousands in Avdiivka, that is probably not the case. But it's all they can really say at this point. Hey, we're effectively defending Avdiivka, and a lot of Russians were killing a lot of Russians. What else can you say? I mean, could the Ukrainians say, well, we're parked along the Avdiivka front, and we're getting shelled day in and day out, and we're being hit by fixed-wing aircraft, and we're losing hundreds of soldiers per day because the Russians have an air force and we don't? Could they really say that? No, absolutely. They cannot say that. They cannot say that. So that's why they're saying what they're saying in terms of the loss or the ability of Ukrainian forces to kill lots of Russian forces. Have the Russians taken casualties? Yes, they have. But probably not on the scale that the Ukrainians are talking about now. Now, another issue here in the United States, obviously we've seen Joseph Biden's crackhead son come up on additional charges. We're seeing a very large percentage of the United States population growing very weary of the Democrats attaching support for Ukrainians to then also protect the U.S. southern border from these hordes of illegal aliens trying to get into this country and change the political dynamics of the United States. Change the United States forever. And many U.S. citizens are very concerned about that. And the same people, the same globalists who are vehemently supporting Ukraine are the same groups of people that are supporting these open borders that are flooding the United States. And Americans are starting to understand what's happening. And they're not going to allow the securing of the southern border to be aligned with providing the Ukraine with unlimited amounts of cash and weaponry. It's just, it has to stop at some point. Those two issues are separate issues and have to be addressed, at least from a budget perspective, separately. Not what the Democrats are trying to do. And then you have to ask, why? Why are the Democrats so infatuated with Zelensky? What does Zelensky have on the Biden administration? Well, I'm going to leave it there. And we'll continue our coverage, and we'll continue to watch what is happening in the conflict, and we will continue to report the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Have a good day, folks.